Welcome, everyone, to the HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership's Faculty Roundtable session for this month of February. This is our first session in this new semester. We're grateful that all of you could come to join us tonight. We know that there are many people in other time zones that will be waiting for the recording of this event. So thank you all for making time to join us. I'm happy to say that we have in our registered list for this program, of course, faculty and staff, students from HJI, as well as alumni from the New York City area, from the United States, different parts of the United States, and also from various countries from around the world. I know that some of you listening this right now in the wee hours of the morning in your time zone. So thank you all for coming and making the effort. Really, our faculty roundtable has become an international event and really helping everyone to understand more about what HGI is doing. So before we proceed any further, I'd just like to let everyone know that I will be putting my contact information in the chat box at some point during the program. I am the Dean of Enrollment Management and Student Life at HGI, and I'm the person that is assisting with helping provide information about studying at HGI, applying to our institution, and at any time, I'm always happy to answer any questions that you or your friends or family may have. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'll also be putting links into the chat box about our programs of study and a link to our online application if you or your friends or family are interested in studying here in the coming semester. To begin our program, I'd like to invite up our HCI President, Dr. Thomas Walsh, who will offer welcome remarks and introduce our main speaker this evening. Dr. Walsh is the 7th President of HJI, and he is a 1979 graduate of then Unification Theological Seminary, now HJ International. After completing his studies at HJI, he went on to earn his PhD at Vanderbilt University's School of Religion, where he specialized in the study of religion and ethics. And since that graduation with his PhD, Dr. Walsh has taught at a significant number of colleges and universities here in the United States. And of course, here at HDI, as president of the institution, he's also a member of our faculty and is currently teaching a very interesting course entitled Ecumenism and Interfaith. Many of you know Dr. Walsh. He's worked for many, many years very closely in different situations with HGI co-founders, Reverend Sung Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jae-han Moon, particularly in the establishment and in the leadership of the Universal Peace Federation International, where until recently, prior to coming to HGI, he served as the international chair. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Walsh here as our president. We've learned a great deal from him. We're really so grateful to be able to work under his able leadership. So let's welcome up Dr. Walsh.
Hey, thank you very much, Dean Stephen Boyd, for your introduction and for pulling this webinar together, working with Angelica Baczynski. So I'm grateful to both of you for always doing such great work. And I think this particular topic has attracted a lot of interest for our wider movement, and we're happy to see that, and we're happy to feature members of HJI's faculty and in addition, members of our board of trustees. And tonight Dr. Famularo will speak, and I'll say a little more about him as the chairman of our board of trustees. I'd like to mention that about a month ago, just about a month, we had a wonderful HJI International Conference that dealt with the development of our church and movement over the course of time since the passing of Father Moon and the ministry of True Mother, who recently indicated that she prefers to be addressed as Holy Mother Han. But this was subtitled A Time for Consideration, and we had some excellent participants from various universities, London School of Economics, University of Stockholm, Clemson, and others who came and joined us. It was a small group of about 20 people, including many of our own scholars and theologians, Dr. Mickler, Dr. Ward, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Shimio, Dr. Selliver, a few others. Great dialogue. One of the sessions was on Christology, which was very, very interesting because those of you that follow our church and movement know that there's been recent development in the Christology aspect of our overall theology. You could say, and in many ways, I think this was a kind of tenet of unificationism or family federation of a certain sense of progressive revelation or the development of doctrine and theology through providential or even dispensational periods. And so this conference kind of highlighted and looked at this 12 to 15-year period in particular. Very fascinating. It was not exclusively on Christology, but a number of other areas. So this, and Dr. Famularo was with us for that and was a major contributor, particularly to the section on Christology, which I very much appreciated. Dr. Hendricks was there also. I didn't mention that earlier. So tonight, the topic is Christology and perspectives on the concept of only begotten, which has a long history in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Dr. Famularo has done a lot of work in this area. So I think it's an exciting topic. We're happy to feature our faculty at any time. I'm hoping Dr. Famularo may consider to do a course on this in the fall. But just a little about him. He, as I said, is the chair of our board of trustees. He's the president of Family Federation Canada. He graduated from HGI, then called UTS in 1994, went on to get his doctor of ministry, earning that in 2020. He is the Canadian representative of the Sunhawk History Institute. He's done a chronology and a history of the Canadian movement, and he's worked closely with faculty member Dr. Michael Mickler on a chronology of our founders' course in the United States, a day-by-day chronology, hour by hour, almost minute by minute. He was blessed in 1992. His lovely wife, they live in Montreal, Chizuru, and their daughter, Nadia. So with that, it is with pleasure that I welcome my good friend, colleague, Dr. Franco Famularo to the floor.
Well, thank you, Dr. Walsh. I felt younger when you said I was blessed in 1992, but it was actually 10 years earlier in 1982.
Okay.
In any case, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I know for some of you it's late or very early in the morning. So thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules and even taking time from your sleep. I see people here from Kenya, from Nigeria, my classmates, and others. So thank you for being here. Just as a way of introduction, when I first heard this term being circulated in our circles in 2014, August, someone at an international meeting said something about monogenes. And I thought, wow, what is that all about? And later on, I was at a conference, and a Lutheran minister who was also a member of parliament in one country in Europe listened to Mother Han's talk. And she asked me, is she saying she's God? And so this was in the midst of my effort to put this to paper. And you can read a short version and a long article about Begotten in the Journal of Unification Studies and also on the old Unification blog. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to go quickly. There's a lot of language. Let me just say from the start, it's complicated. It's not something that you'd go to a movie for, but in any case, some linguistic, historical, and theological issues on the concept of begotten. And this is an overview. I'll take you through most of these steps here on what does begotten mean to Christians, and hopefully try to conclude with the application to true parents' thought. There are many terms that we use in unification circles like Messiah, salvation, Trinity, Christology, begotten, second coming, and more recently, Holy Mother. These are terms that have different meanings to Jews, Christians, Muslims, and people of other faiths. So I like to use the example of apples and oranges. If I tell you that this is an apple, and then after a short time you discover that I'm calling it an orange, you may have a hard time understanding what this is all about. So if someone calls an apple for 1,500 years and you come along and say, well, we don't really mean that, we mean something else, you're going to have a hard time communicating with that person. So Christians have many different perspectives on this. Talk to them about begotten. Some will give you one view, others will give you another. Also, the translators, the linguists have different perspectives, so it's complicated. This term has circulated in family fed circles since the summer of 2014. On July 1st, 2014, just after appointing her daughter, True Mother, said, I, the True Mother, sitting before you today, am the only begotten daughter of God, born after 6,000 years. This was the first time publicly that I could find, and most leaders first heard of this at the August 2014 meeting in Korea, which I attended. But what did Hakshahan say in Korean? She said, Doksenyo, and you have it there in Korean, which means, transliterated, only born daughter. And what is she trying to convey? What is she trying to say? Maybe many of us have opinions of what she means, but we still haven't figured out fully what she's trying to say. So the term begotten can be easily misunderstood. Various translations in English, and within our family federation, if you look at our literature from 2014 to 2018 especially, there was a back and forth between using the word only or using the word only begotten. It was also a challenge for the translators of the Bible, who in the 1940s and 50s especially, as new biblical sources appeared, there were many issues with that. And you know very well that the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, for those of you that studied the divine principle in English, was the version cited, and it does not use the word begotten. The term mostly is used to emphasize that Jesus was born without human conception, and also to emphasize that Jesus is God, not a manifestation of God, not a substantial body of God, but God the Creator. And Christians, as you know, have many different views. It depends if you're talking with the mainstream churches or if you're talking with various other groups such as Pentecostal, evangelicals, you name them. They have different perspectives. But the Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek. Our founders speak Korean, and the Bible was translated from English to Korean. In fact, they used the King James Version, and then our founders' words are translated back into English. And for those of you from other countries who speak Spanish or French or German or any other language for that matter, you'll find that often and within the unification movement, the English translation is consulted for guidance on Korean terms. Of course, it's best if you consult the original, but this is what happens. So given that, theologians are not always linguists, and linguists are not always theologians. In fact, we need both. And this is an effort to clarify the linguistic and theological challenges. Some words have a lot of historical baggage, and we can learn many lessons from history where translation caused upheaval. You've all heard the expression, don't change one iota. Expressions like this originate in the Bible if you read Matthew 5:18, and also from the Council of Nicaea. This is one version of that. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, there's different renditions of this verse. You won't always find the word iota even in this verse, because they have different opinions on the translation. So let's go to the Council of Nicaea. It's also known as Nicaea. It's near Iznik in present-day Turkey. The council was convened by the Emperor Constantine in May 325, and the emperor covered all travel and lodging and food expenses for the participants. This year, it's appropriate that 1700-year anniversary since the Council of Nicaea. At the Council of Nicaea, the bishops of the church assembled to resolve the controversy of Arianism, which taught that Jesus was created by God out of nothing, or ex nihilo. So the questions that they were asking were, was Jesus homoousios? Was he heterousios? Or was he homoiousios? Now, if you don't know Greek, and I don't profess to know Greek well, it's complicated. And the main issues were, was Jesus of the same essence or substance as God, homoousios, or was he, as proposed by Arius, of a similar essence, an essence created by God out of nothing, heterousios, or was he, as suggested by Eusebius of Caesarea, who was trying to work out a compromise solution by introducing the term homoiousios, which means that Jesus was of a similar essence or substance, but not of the same essence or substance as God. So similar, the same, or different. So the Greek letter in the end, iota, made all the difference. And in the end, it led to a split, and the Arians actually continued till about 700 AD or so, till the 7th century or the 6th century, the 7th century. And this conflict between the Arians and the folks that became the mainstream church, the followers of Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, and the views of Athanasius basically led to a split. So in the view of Nicaea, very simply, Jesus is God. Jesus is the creator. And this led to certain creeds being developed, the Nicene Creed of 325, and then later in 381. There are multiple translations of that. This is accepted by Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants. And then also the Apostles' Creed, which is accepted by Catholics and most Protestants. I don't want to read all this, but I want to draw your attention to one particular segment where it says, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one essence or substance with the Father. The original Greek doesn't use begotten, it uses monogenes, which we'll come to in a minute. The Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed of 381 also makes that same emphasis and adds about the Holy Spirit, which isn't in the original version. And this is the Apostles' Creed. Some of you may remember reciting this if you're from a Christian background. So the word used in Greek was monogenes. It translated into English as begotten almost 1,300 years later. There were other disputes over language. For example, filioque, Trinity, Holy Mother, these are also words. For example, in 589 AD, the issue was, did the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father only or from the Father and the Son? This was brought in by the Western Church in order to deal with another Arian challenge, especially in Spain with the Visigoths, who were Arian. Many of the Germanic tribes were Arian. And the filioque crisis eventually led to the split between Western Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Byzantine Orthodox Church. These three words and the Son led to the split. Then you have the Trinity. I don't want to bore you, but there are many words here in Greek that were translated back and forth between Greek and Latin, ousia, hypostasis, prosopon, and so forth. So just give you one example here. Hypostasis and prosopon were translated to Latin as persona, which led to more confusion because hypostasis essentially means the individual, distinct person within the divine nature of God, whereas prosopon is the outward manifestation or face of the person. So these terms and others remind me of my childhood as I grew up in the Italian Catholic Church here in Montreal, and the priest would say during the Eucharist, mistero della fede, mystery of the faith. And there are so many mysteries that we haven't been able to understand, such as the transubstantiation, the Trinity, and how God allowed Jesus to be born without conception. Theotokos is another one. You know, we now hear that we're using the term Holy Mother Han. Well, it's primarily used in two contexts, the Virgin Mary or the Holy Mother Church. And it's the most common and traditional bearer of the title is the Virgin Mary. In fact, she's seen as the Mother of God. Theotokos means the Mother of God. So when we say these words to Christians, this is what may trigger in their mind. Not all Christians are devotees of Mary, but there you have it. Now, for our founder, Hakchahan, we have many names. Mother and True Mother, Mother Moon, Mother of Peace, Only Daughter, Only Begotten Daughter, Wang Oma, and since January of this year, Holy Mother Han. And we unificationists were all about resolving differences, even differences among people of different persuasions within our ranks. So what does begotten mean to Christians? I want to look at this from the biblical translations and more. Begotten in relation to Jesus is used in some, but not all English translations of the Bible. The most well-known is the King James Version. The verse most quoted is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You can also find the word begotten in John 3:18, John 1:14, and so forth. And there are several other verses as well. But the word monogenes is not always translated as begotten. Sometimes it's translated in another way, which I'll come to. So begotten suggests originating or produced by someone else. Most important is that a being begets someone or something like itself. And C.S. Lewis, in his radio talks of the 1940s, which were published in 1952, said the following: "We don't use the words begetting or begotten much in modern English." This is in the 1940s, by the way. But everyone still knows what they mean. To beget is to become the father of, to create, is to make. And the difference is this: when you beget something of the same kind as yourself. A man begets a human babies, a beaver begets little beavers, and a bird begets eggs, which turn into little birds. But when you make or create something of a different kind from yourself, an example is a bird makes a nest, or a beaver builds a dam, or a man makes a wireless set, or he may make something more like himself than a wireless, or say something like a statue. Think Michelangelo and the David. Now, about this word monogenes, the New Testament was written in Greek. The Greek word used in all biblical verses translated into English as begotten is monogenes. The G is pronounced as in go or get, monogenes. What does it mean? It means only one of a kind, or unique in kind. Literally, it means only or of the same kind. And the Greek word can be used as an adjective, meaning unique and special, or on its own as a noun, as in the only one or the only legitimate child. Also, it can be understood as an adjective compounded of mono, only, and genes, which means kind. Thus, it's translated in the most modern versions of the Bible as only one of a kind or unique. The genes in monogenes is not the root word for Genesis, generation, gestation, or generate in English. In fact, when you look at the Greek version of the Nicene Creed, this is what they use: genethenta ou poithenta, which means begotten, not made. Genau means to beget, but monogenes means only or one of a kind. Yet, even though this debate rages, there have been strong debates about the meaning among scholars because it seems to challenge the divinity of Jesus. And this is what they were faced with. Now, to get back to the roots of this, we have to look at something that happened more than 1,000 years earlier, because Latin was the other major language used in the early Christian period. And originally, they used the word unicus in early Latin translations of the Bible. And the meaning is identical to the Greek word monogenes. In fact, if you read most versions of the Bible in French, they still use the word unique, which means unicos, which means monogenes. The only French translation of that uses the word engendré that I could find is the French translation of the King James Version in English, if you can believe that. So the word in question again was drawn from the biblical verses mentioned earlier, namely John 3:16, etc., for the formulation of the Nicene Creed. This is the word monogenes. Interestingly, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the version most often used in the divine principle text, does not use the phrase only begotten Son in the key verses mentioned above, but uses the phrase only Son. So because unificationists in the English-speaking world have referenced the Revised Standard Version of the Bible in much of their literature since the first English rendition of divine principle in 1956, the English word begotten was hardly ever used in unification literature or discourse before the mid-1990s. But for some reason, when exposition of divine principle was completed in 1996, some of you on this call may have been involved in the editing. For some reason, they introduced the word begotten in 5 different occasions and referenced the King James Version of the Bible. Don't know why. In these particular instances, these 5 pages, 1123, 271, and 278, 402, on these different topics. And also, we find the use of the word begotten in some, but not all English translations of Reverend and Mrs. Moon's speeches, going back to the 1950s. So if you look at earlier versions of the translation, many times they don't use the word begotten for whatever reason. Now, Reverend and Mrs. Moon have been addressing the issue of Jesus' divinity and uniqueness for decades. And how did the translators go from a word monogenes, which means unique or one of a kind, and turn it into begotten? Well, you have to look back a few hundred years. Go back to William Tyndale. He produced the first English translation directly from Hebrew and Greek in the early 1500s, at around the same time as Martin Luther produced the version in German. And it's estimated that when the 54 scholars who produced the King James Version of the New Testament gathered, they utilized so much of Tyndale's version that 83% of King James Version is identical to Tyndale's version, except in one area, because Tyndale didn't use the word begotten. For example, this is his version of John 3:16. So then you have to go back a little further to the time of Jerome. Jerome lived between 347 and 420. His translation, the Vulgata, was the main Latin source for more than 1,000 years. And translations don't occur in a vacuum. They're often theological, political, and other influences. And he was battling the Arians during this time. And in the Cathedral of Vercelli in northern Italy, one finds the most well-known Old Latin codex. The Gospel translates the word monogenes as unicos in Latin. But Jerome, for some reason, used the word unigenitus, which means only born, and can mean something close to begotten. Jerome lived in the midst of this Arian controversy of the 4th century, and he changed the existing Latin text from unicos to unigenitum. Why? Because of the Council of Nicaea. You should know that between the Council of Nicaea in 325 and 400 or so, there was a raging battle between the Arians and those that did not agree with them, the mainstream church at the time. There are many horrible stories that maybe some historian can tell you about, but you can read all about it. So Jerome made changes specifically to verses in the Bible and changed the word in Latin from unicos to unigenitum. And he apparently made the change due to an interest in ecclesiastical dogma due to the theological battle with Arianism. The King James Version of 1611 translated from the Latin word unigenitus to the English word begotten, and not from the original Greek. That's why later versions in the 1940s and 50s until now have dropped the word altogether from their versions of the Bible. But this is a very controversial issue because some people will swear by the King James Version as being the only authorized version of the Bible. So when the Revised Standard Version of the Bible was published in the late 40s, there was a big controversy. The translators were being accused of being liberal, of attacking belief in the divinity and the virgin birth. And this was quite controversial because it was seen as an attack of traditional Christian views of Jesus and the Council of Nicaea. But the translators, they simply saw themselves as translating the word monogenes, which had been an error and had been used for over 300 years. It's no easy task, no easy task. It's probably just as difficult to change something like this after 5 years or 10 years. So according to the translators, the Greek word monogenes simply didn't mean begotten. It means only or one of a kind. Now, the translators of the King James Version had their view. Some Christians today have a different view, and other Christians agree with this view that I'm just presenting here. So it's not like one even playing field where all Christians believe the same. It's complicated. There are numerous words and instances in the Bible where monogenes is translated as only. The Hebrew word used in the same text is yeshid. So you can find this as in Judges 11:34, in Jeremiah 6:26, and in the New Testament, there are so many instances where they use the only son of his mother. They don't use the word begotten when translating the word monogenes. And the simple reason for this is because the verses are used to make reference to the divinity of Jesus. So again, not all theologians are linguists, and not all linguists are theologians. Very few are both. In other languages, you have in Spanish, hijo unigénito or hijo único. In French, they'll use engendré or unique. In German, eingeboren or einzigen. In Italian, unigénito or unico. Not all translations of the Bible are the same. It depends who you're talking to. But what is stated in Korean again? Dokseña means only born son. Dokseño, which is the term that Mother Han uses, means only born daughter. What does she mean by saying that? So, like I said, since the summer of 2014, she's been referring to herself as Dokseño in Korean, which means only born daughter. Does it mean begotten, or does it mean that she's uniquely born? Does it mean that she's the only born child of God, only born daughter? What is she trying to convey? So the first Korean versions of the Bible into Korean were translated from the English of a team of American and Canadians, from what I understand. So even if you use Korean dictionaries, you're bound to get the incorrect translation. And the Hebrew and Greek versions should be consulted more than the English version or the Korean version in this case. So what does it mean in Greek? Monogenes, as I mentioned before, doesn't mean begotten. It means more precisely that Jesus was uniquely born, that he was God's only son, that he was an only child, a unique child, because their purpose was to show that Jesus was in a completely different class. So, Nicene Christians believe Jesus is God, the creator, and that he pre-existed his birth. Unificationists have taught that Jesus is both divine and human, and do not teach that Jesus is God the creator. And we definitely don't profess that Sun Myung Moon and Hak Shahan are God the creator. So when you use the word begotten, most educated Christians will more than likely think of Jesus as the only begotten Son who is God the creator, is born miraculously without conception, and is born of a virgin. And we need to consider this important point in the Nicene Creed, begotten, not made. This is what rings in my ears when I hear begotten, not made. So the nature of the Messiah is that we don't view Sun Myung Moon and Hak Shahan as God the creator, nor do they teach that they were not conceived by human beings. We know very well that they had a physical father and mother, and both referred to their physical parents extensively. And the exposition of the divine principle in the chapter on Christology says this: nevertheless, he is not God himself when referencing Jesus. So finally, how do we apply this to true parents' thought? The English translation of Korean impacts the world. My concern is, how can we communicate effectively? Translators made corrections to the Bible in English more than 300 years after the publication and widespread use of the King James Version. We may need to correct ourselves eventually. Does the founder teach that she was born differently from all human beings? I don't think so. She definitely never thought that they were born without physical parents. Is the founder promoting two classes of human beings where there's a begotten class and a class that is not? I'm not too sure about that. And again, I go back to this. It's complex. The translation of both the Korean terms used is filled with conceptual and linguistic complexities, but something to consider as we study this further. We're still a very young movement. Does begotten accurately convey what Hak Chahan is teaching in Korean? What is she trying to say? Someone maybe should ask her so that we can get it straight from her. What is she trying to say about her nature, about the way she came to be? Is she the firstborn daughter of God, or the first daughter of God to fulfill the purpose of creation? Some suggest purely begotten, that she was purely begotten, but still we're dealing with this word in trying to communicate with Christians. So it's a loaded word with a lot of theological baggage, and it means different things, especially to adherents of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, who represent practically half the world's population. Judaism simply rejects the notion of a begotten son or daughter miraculously born of a virgin. And deification of Jesus has been a stumbling block for both Jews and Muslims. Adherents of Islam, for those of you that come from such a background, generally accept the virgin birth, but begetting of Jesus, or that he was sired by God, is considered blasphemous. Christian missionaries to Islamic countries discovered that Islam views itself as the purest form of monotheism. And this is a verse from Surah number 112. He is Allah, the one and only Allah, the eternal absolute. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him. Some people ask me, well, Mother went to Niger and to Senegal and to these French-speaking countries, and they accepted her, but she wasn't speaking to them through an English translator, but through a French translator who used the word unique. So for traditional Christians, the term begotten is almost always associated with the view and belief that Jesus was not conceived as are all other humans. God begat a God, namely Jesus, who was conceived supernaturally and born of a virgin. Unification teaching, however, is quite clear. Jesus, Sun Myung Moon, and Hak Chahan were born of physical parents. So the point is not to forge unification views to accommodate the beliefs of others, but to communicate effectively and accurately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Famularo. Excellent and very, very informative presentation, well researched and well communicated. I was reflecting on, in many ways that as our theology has developed, we've had to redefine or innovatively define terms like God. Often the doctrine of God, God is not a God capable of let's say, experiencing pain or suffering or grief or agony in some traditions, but stands over and above all that. But defining the God of heart. And the same with Messiah, as you know, and many of our audience today know, of explaining, even when we were at that time talking about Reverend Moon's father's role as Messiah, and saying, but as you said, not Messiah as the same second person of the Trinity as understood in the Council of Nicaea, and not a virgin birth, not a bodily resurrection, yet still that term can can apply, but in a kind of somewhat new way, but also finding that there have been others who have also defined Messiah somewhat similarly. And I think you kind of concluded on what does Holy Mother Han want to convey by using this concept, because you rightly pointed out very well the issue that she believes fully and has the deepest love for her mother and grandmother and her father, and has written extensively about them. A lot of things that you help us see more clearly, and as we all kind of try to better understand this terminology and what it means. In terms of some of the questions, and as you listen, we have about 15 minutes that we can do some, ask Dr. Famularo some questions. I mean, just following up on what I said, I did see one from Henry Schaufler, who asked a similar question. And I think you began to kind of answer that. Of course, you want more clarification from Mother herself, but what theological concepts, he asked, do you think she is trying to convey? Have you kind of come to terms with, we don't mean this by the term, and we don't mean that, but we do mean something like this?
Yes, it's complicated, as Henri says in his question. It's complicated in any language, and growing up Catholic, we had many names for Holy Mother Mary in many languages, as the Virgin Mary, as the Madonna, as this, as that, and all of you who come from different backgrounds probably had different names. So what is she trying to convey? I think that she is truly a holy person that reflects the motherly nature of God. This is my grasp of it at this point, but I don't profess to have the ultimate and complete conclusion on this issue. I was in Las Vegas when Mother actually conveyed this, because our missionaries from Canada offered a photo album to Mother, and she actually signed her name, Holy Mother Han, for the first time on that photo album from Canada. So just for your information. But I'll stop there.
So there's an interesting question, if you'd like to comment on that, from Gunnar Johnston and Melissa Brasseau about Adam and Eve. Have you given thought? There hasn't been much stated that I'm aware of about the status of the birth of Adam and Eve, and whether they were at that time only begotten, or that didn't apply to the Adam and Eve.
Yes, so Adam and Eve were begotten by God. Could be. I've heard different theories on how they were created, but I wasn't there, so I can't really comment on that right now. Maybe someone else who has more knowledge of the origins of the universe and the origin of creation and how it blends with the evolutionary process might be able to answer that. But yes, in a way, God created human beings, but would they be gods because they were begotten? I think the emphasis on using the term is to emphasize that Jesus was a God.
Yeah, and as you said, virgin birth and various other things that went with the position of being the Christ and the Messiah, as it came to be in many ways redefined vis-a-vis Judaism. So terminology shifted in the transition from Jewish Christians to Christianity that was no longer embedded in a Jewish context, and terminology gets changed, especially by the time of Nicaea in 325, as you pointed out. Michael Herbers says that Jesus, I think he means according to Divine Principle or Unification Church, was the first begotten human who could be claimed as God's child. And then says, is Mother claiming that she is the first woman who could be claimed in that position? I think the answer is yes to that.
Yeah. The idea is that Jesus would be the first man to fulfill the purpose of creation as an individual. And here the emphasis would be that Hakchahan would be the first woman to fulfill the purpose of creation. So she's the firstborn daughter of God in that respect.
And yet the begottenness is about origination more than fulfilling a responsibility. So we do, I guess we don't say that an individual with the only begotten status has no responsibility, so that it would seem that the fulfillment of the principle of creation has something to do with development after having been begotten, rather than, in Christology, as you know, there's this theory of adoptionist Christology, that Jesus performed so well that he was adopted as God's only son. And that was rejected by the church. So I don't get that sense, but that through Holy Mother Han's grandmother and mother, the kind of providence that was fulfilled through her birth created that status. Now, to what extent fulfilling the purpose of creation or fulfilling responsibility applies within that framework, I guess we're still
Trying to figure it out.
Through.
Yeah, we're dealing with religious people of conviction. And this is never easy in having a rational, dispassionate, calm discussion. When they were battling over homoousios and homoiousios back in the day, in the 4th century, there's a story where a group went to the group that believed one or the other with clubs hidden under their cloaks, and then killed 37 of them on the spot, right? So there's a lot of passion that emerges here. And I see Dr. Wilson's hand up there, so I don't want to suppose that he's full of passion about a certain perspective, but maybe it'd be good to hear what his question is.
Good. Sorry I missed that. Dr. Wilson.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you for taking my question. As someone who was involved in the 1995 translation of exposition, I think one of the problems with this only begotten versus only, this monogenesis issue, is I don't think we want to say that only true mother is a son of God and only true father is a son of God, because we can all be sons and daughters of God. So the term only begotten talks about their position at the head of the lineage, as several other people have mentioned, because Adam and Eve were, in a sense, begotten of God, and they are taking their place. So it's a second Adam, second Eve type theology. So I don't think you can get so much mileage out of the monogenes issue. I think, as others have said, let's try to understand what True Mother's trying to do, and let's see if we can find a way to explain it as she does. But definitely, as you started your presentation, I totally agree with you The true mother is not saying that she's God, which is the standard meaning of Nicaea based upon the first chapter of John, that Jesus is God, begotten of the Father, meaning that he is of a totally different essence than a human being, whereas everybody else, we can be children of God, but not uh, the essence of God. And so definitely on that point, when we talk to Christians, it's really very likely that many Christians are going to have that kind of misunderstanding when they hear this notion of only begotten daughter, because of that historical tradition in Christianity that this is a divine term.
Mm.
I want to just commend you on going into this thicket of terminology and theology, and you're doing a great job. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson. I know that you considered this seriously and deeply, along with Dr. Hendricks, who has also written extensively on this matter, and others. And we're still not there, in my view. We still have a lot of work to do in order to communicate our message effectively. Because it's one thing to have the charisma, as we learned in Dr. Shimio's classes long ago. And then how do you communicate that charisma, the message of God? But now I also see Dr. Ward there, who's got a lot of sensitivity for this matter. Dr. Walsh, in case you missed him.
Dr. Ward, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Famularo. That was really, I think, an excellent presentation. And I think for anyone who is not familiar with some of the issues relating to this, it was a blessing to hear all this. I'm so glad you could share with us tonight. I think we all recognize the problems that have existed in translating from Korean to English. I think, for example, of the early years when we talked about how Abel has to subjugate Cain, and the way that that ended up somehow appearing in the anti-cult movement as really something very militant and very threatening. And it would have been so much better if we would have simply said Abel has to win over Cain. If we had used the right language, that would have made a huge difference. I guess I consider myself much more of a linguist than a theologian. So speaking from a linguistic perspective, I would just say there is so much that's tied to the feeling of language, and there's also so much tied to the feeling of a culture which is not one's own. So I don't know, my own experience as an interpreter is I would like to say to people sometimes, I can translate from English into Spanish or English into French. But if you can afford it, I would suggest to use me just for French into English or Spanish into English, because I promise you, I won't just translate the words, I'll translate the feelings, And I think that the issue is there are deep feelings that are connected to this begotten. I think as a fellow Roman Catholic, I empathize with your observation. When I hear the word begotten, I hear begotten, not made. Because that was pounded into us. And those of us who are Roman Catholics in background, we didn't study the scriptures so much, but we sure studied, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and we know very well begotten, not made, So that term is a very difficult term. It creates a huge obstacle from the very beginning, I think, for Roman Catholics or high church Anglicans and others to accept, simply because of that fact. So in a sense, in some way, we have already kind of that ship has left, so to speak. That choice was made. We probably can't go back easily, quickly. So I think we find ourselves obligated to explain. Now, when I use this term, this is what I mean. I think we have to explain that to Christians because we know what it feels like to hear that term if it's not explained. So that'd be my observation. But thank you for an excellent presentation, and thanks, Dr. Walsh, for putting this together tonight.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ward. I see Dr. Hendricks has a comment that kind of follows up on this. Dr. Famularo, maybe keep any response to Dr. Ward, but let me just see if Dr. Hendricks wants to add anything. He wrote a comment that more universalizes the concept of being begotten of God, that we're all God's children. Do you want to add anything, Dr. Hendricks?
Well, I agree with Dr. Ward's comment. I mean, it was very good. I'm sorry I was late. I had another commitment. I just heard the last 10 minutes of your talk, Franco, but it was good. It really was well put together. But I heard it, and I appreciated Dr. Ward's that we have to comment. And I think yours implicitly. I think if you ask your mother, what do you mean by only begotten? I don't think mother's a theologian. And anyway, it'd be interesting what she said. But I think we need to simply explain what we mean by this. And then Catholics, et cetera, high church people would say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. That makes more sense than what we've believed for 2,000 years. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay.
I wish it was as easy as you make it out to be. But these words are loaded. They're loaded. And as Dr. Ward was sharing before, all these feelings go into the word. Here I'm in Montreal where we speak French. And every time there's a memo or some communication, like, for example, Heavenly Parent Holy Community. Well, one of the translators here is always asking me, well, which one is it? Is it the parent that's holy? Is it the community that's holy? Which is holy? Because French is more specific than English in these terms. And I don't know what it is in Korean. So we get into a mix of things. And English is so important because it is, broken English is the universal language of our movement, whether we like it or not. Don't tell the French that here in Quebec because they won't like that. But this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with all the time. And I can imagine for the Italians, the Germans, the Russians, when they're dealing with these issues, they really look for guidance to the folks in the Western, in the American and English-speaking world. I do agree also with Dr. Wilson that the issue of monogenes isn't the real issue. It's something that we need to be able to understand so we know where this all comes from as we try to communicate our message. You're muted, Dr. Walsh.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful discussion, and the chat column is really worth reviewing. And I hope you get a chance to look at it when you're not having to be the main presenter here. But we are going to need to wrap it up now. I do note that there were a number of good comments from your colleague up in Canada, David Stewart. But I'm going to give you the last word here, Dr. Famularo, to kind of offer some concluding remarks.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I think this could be the first of several presentations and discussions about this. I would be very happy to get into a full-fledged course on this matter because each of those slides is probably enough for one class. And I hope that you all can benefit from this, that we can develop the sensitivities that we need so that we can represent our message well, so that we can represent our God well, so that we can communicate sensitively and with real understanding of who we're trying to communicate with when we're talking to a Roman Catholic or a Greek Orthodox or an Anglican or United Church of Christ or Presbyterian and whichever other denomination we're dealing with, because and Muslims and Jews and people of other faiths, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, you name them, we need to get into their minds and try to understand where they're from, so before we can communicate effectively. So, being married interracially to someone from Japan, I know that it took her 7 years to understand that I was joking about certain things, because Italian joking is a little different from Japanese. And if you think in those terms when we're trying to communicate our message, it's really a work of art to really communicate effectively so that the other person can understand what we're saying. So, in conclusion, thank you again. Thank you especially to those in Europe who are up late, in Africa, and for those in Asia who have woken up early. I see my good friend there, Robert Kittle, on the course, and he's teaching at HJI this time. So thank you all for joining, and very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Famularo. Dean Boyd, I'm going to turn it back over to you for final comments.
Well, thank you, Dr. Walsh, and thank you, Dr. Famularo, for an amazing presentation. So well researched and very well delivered. You've provoked a lot of thought and deeper understanding, I think, on the part of all of us here. And as someone has asked, the recording will be available shortly. We simply need to format it and edit it. We'll get it up on our homepage, and also it'll be on the HCI YouTube channel. So the link to that is in the chat already. Thank you again, everybody, for coming tonight. Please be on the lookout for an invitation for our March Faculty Roundtable. It'll probably be held sometime towards the third week or so of March. I'm sure it'll be just as exciting as this program tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Walsh, as always, for your able hosting of our program and handling such the questions and the comments from our participants so ably.